holds up, it would mean the impact that nearly ended complex life on Earth left its mark directly beneath the Antarctic ice, hidden from view for 250 million years. Closer to the coast, one of West Antarctica's largest glaciers is already collapsing from underneath as warmer ocean water erodes its base, carving out a cavity beneath the ice large enough to swallow a major city. If that glacier fully destabilizes, it alone could raise global sea levels by more than half a meter. Behind it sits the rest of the West Antarctic ice sheet, holding enough frozen water to raise sea levels by several meters if it were ever lost. That single glacier functions as a kind of cork holding back a far larger, far more consequential body of ice. None of this, the ice records, the hidden lakes, the volcanoes, the buried mountains, exists in a vacuum. It exists underneath a continent that multiple nations still consider, in some legal sense, partially their own, protected by a treaty that includes a built-in expiration point. The 1991 Environmental Protocol added to the Antarctic Treaty specifically banned mining on the continent, but that ban is scheduled for mandatory review in 2048, and it can be modified if enough signatory nations agree to revisit it. That single detail turns a seemingly settled international agreement into a countdown. Antarctica is estimated to hold significant reserves of oil, natural gas, coal, and valuable metals, but the resource drawing the most serious strategic attention is rare earth elements, materials essential for electric vehicles, advanced electronics, and military technology, currently dominated by a small handful of countries. A meaningful new source of rare earths would reshape global supply chains overnight. Some nations appear to be positioning themselves accordingly. Research stations have expanded rapidly in number in recent years. Icebreaker fleets have grown in size and capability. Survey vessels have spent years quietly mapping the seafloor around the continent, gathering exactly the kind of data that would only matter if the rules governing extraction ever changed. None of this technically violates the treaty. All of it looks very much like preparation for the moment the treaty's protections come up for renegotiation. Antarctica has no permanent population, no standing government, and no military presence under the current treaty, which is precisely what makes it so combustible. It is a landmass with enormous latent value, governed by an agreement with a known expiration date, sitting at the intersection of climate science, resource competition, and unresolved territorial disputes that have already produced armed conflict once before. The ice covering Antarctica is not simply frozen water. It is an atmospheric archive stretching back over 1 million years, a hidden ocean system with its own ecosystems, a buried volcanic field larger than almost any other on Earth, a lost mountain range no one has ever climbed, and possibly the physical scar of the most devastating extinction event in the planet's history. For now, it remains sealed away, protected by paper and precedent rather than force. But paper agreements can be revisited, precedent can be challenged, and the countries paying closest attention to what lies beneath that ice are already positioning themselves for the day the rules change. The clock on that protection is already running. And when it runs out, the world may find that the quietest, coldest, emptiest place on Earth was never really empty at all. It was simply waiting. Deliveries already arriving before the physical ship conversions were even finished. There's also speculation, based on concept art circulated by defense contractors, that future iterations of these carriers could eventually operate combat drones alongside or instead of manned aircraft, though nothing on that front has moved past the concept stage. Here's where things get almost absurd. Despite the F-35BS, despite the reshaped bow, despite the heat-resistant decking, the Japanese government has never officially classified the Zumo or the Kaga as aircraft carriers. On paper, they remain multi-purpose operation destroyers. That's not a marketing choice. It's a legal one. Aircraft carriers sit in the same restricted category as ICBMs and strategic bombers under Japan's interpretation of Article 9. Calling these ships carriers outright would force a much harder constitutional and political conversation. Defenders of the program argue the distinction isn't purely cosmetic. The ships are smaller than a typical American or Chinese fleet carrier. They lack catapults, and their primary stated mission still includes anti-submarine warfare and command and control functions rather than sustained offensive strike operations. Both vessels carry advanced radar systems, phalanx close-in weapon systems, and layered air defense, and they're built to serve as coordination hubs for accompanying destroyers, submarines, and aircraft during a crisis, arguably their most valuable function in an actual conflict. Whether that makes them something meaningfully different from a carrier, or just a carrier with better branding, is the exact debate that's been playing out among defense analysts since 2018. Owning the hardware and actually knowing how to run it are two very different things, and Japan has spent the last several years discovering just how large that gap is. No one currently serving in the Japanese Navy has operational experience running a fixed-wing carrier. The last time Japan flew jets off a ship was during World War II. Carrier flight deck operations are famously unforgiving. Every movement is choreographed down to the second, and there's essentially zero margin for error before things go catastrophically wrong. That's where the United States has stepped in. Because Japan and the U.S. are treaty allies, the U.S. Marine Corps, which already operates F-35Bs off its own amphibious ships, has effectively become Japan's training partner. In 2024, the Kaga sailed to waters near California to run joint trials with American F-35Bs, including night landing operations and maximum load launch tests. In 2025, it went a step further, conducting joint flight deck operations involving F-35Bs from Japan, the United States, and the United Kingdom simultaneously, the first time those three nations had operated together in that configuration. The benefit isn't one-directional either. Both the US and UK have their own interest in refining short takeoff, vertical landing carrier operations, an area both countries had somewhat neglected while investing heavily in larger, catapult-equipped supercarriers. Japan's trials are giving all three navies fresh operational data. Each Izumo-class ship requires a crew of roughly 1,000 people to run, and training that many sailors and pilots in an entirely new discipline is, by most estimates, the single slowest part of this whole transformation, slower even than the physical shipyard work. None of this happened in a vacuum. Japan's pivot from strictly defensive doctrine towards something closer to genuine power projection is a direct response to China's rapidly expanding military footprint in the region, and specifically to the deteriorating relationship between the two countries over Taiwan. China regards Taiwan as a breakaway province rather than an independent state and has been increasingly explicit about reunification by force if diplomacy fails. Japan, meanwhile, has deep economic and historical ties to Taiwan and has publicly stated that a Chinese attack on the island would be treated as an existential threat to Japan itself, given their geographic proximity. That position alone has been enough to sour relations badly. China has responded with trade restrictions and a steady increase in military pressure around Japanese territory. Warships lingering for days in contested straits, fishing fleets used to push Japanese vessels out of their own waters, and repeated airspace incursions, sometimes alongside Russian aircraft. The most visible flashpoint is the Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea, administered by Japan but claimed by both China and Taiwan. Chinese Coast Guard vessels maintain a near-constant presence in the surrounding waters, a slow-motion pressure campaign that shows no sign of easing. Beyond the islands, China's Navy, now the largest in the world by ship count and including 3 operational aircraft carriers, sits astride shipping lanes Japan depends on for the bulk of its energy and trade imports. China has also built and militarized roughly 24 artificial islands across the South China Sea, several equipped with airstrips, extending its reach over waters Japan's supply chains pass through daily. For a country with almost no land borders and total dependence on maritime trade routes, that combination of naval buildup and territorial pressure is genuinely existential in a way it wouldn't be for a country with other options. Fighter jets alone can't solve the problem. Their range is limited, and without carrier-based air cover, Japanese naval forces operating far from home shores would be dangerously exposed. The Izumo-class conversion is Japan's answer. Mobile airbases that can extend air cover to wherever the fleet needs to operate, rather than tying that cover to fixed runways on the home islands. Unsurprisingly, Beijing hasn't been quiet about any of this. Chinese officials urged caution when the conversion plan was first floated in 2018, and state media has since repeatedly framed the program as evidence of Japanese remilitarization, language deliberately chosen to invoke memories of the 1930s and 40s. Given that Japan's wartime occupation of China remains a deeply sensitive and painful chapter in both countries' histories, that reaction isn't entirely without basis, even if Japan's current program bears little resemblance to its imperial-era military ambitions. Where this goes from here is still an open question. There have been persistent but unconfirmed reports that Japan is exploring future drone carrier concepts and next-generation fighter development, potentially in partnership with the UK and Italy through the ongoing Global Combat Air Program. None of that is locked in, and defense programs of this scale routinely shift, slip, or get scaled back entirely. What's clear right now is this. Two ships that started life as unassuming helicopter destroyers have become the clearest signal, yet that Japan's decades-old defensive posture is shifting under real geopolitical pressure. Whether the Izumo and Kaga end up formally called aircraft carriers or stay multi-purpose destroyers forever is, in the end, a matter of semantics. What they can actually do on the water tells the real story, and that story is one very few people outside defense circles have been paying close attention to until now.